Welcome to another Adventure Mechanics side quest. I'm Chandler. Good games aren't easy to make per se, but they can stumble on how everything interacts and still be good. Great games take all things and make them work in concert. A story that works with the actions of the player to not only make the game more immersive, but also get the game's intended emotion across is far better than a good game. Today, let's talk about using mechanics in your game to make the point. If you've ever played a game where it intentionally pushed you to play a specific way, such as desperate decisions in Papers, Please or being the true hero in The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, you'll notice that the mere act of playing gets you into the game more than, say, an abstract puzzle or a bit of expository lore does. As the old idiom goes, actions speak louder than words. When a player is doing something diegetic in your world, you're demanding that they buy into what you've created. You're asking them to be an active participant, not just an observer. This buy-in is very, very powerful. It's forcing them to actively think about the action they're doing and can push them to do things that they otherwise would object to. And if your game is about getting a message across, this is valuable. Let's talk about that. Do you have a specific emotion that you want to get across to the player? Do you want them to feel desperate or overwhelmed, like they're not contributing something good, bad, or ugly? Make them do something. Sure, you can preface it with lore and audio dumps, but those are the appetizers to the main thing you want to get across. When a player realizes that they're not the good guy and are committing heinous acts, they're more likely to think about what they're doing. When the player has to balance their home life requirement and checking all the paperwork at their checkpoint, they're going to feel that pang of desperation. And as long as you don't get too heavy-handed with the message, you'll get the player to consider what you're getting across, at the very least. For a less extreme example of this, let's look at the contentious mechanic in Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and its sequel, weapon durability. In previous installments, your weapons were linear improvements and, more importantly, indestructible. You could rely on them being there when you needed them, unless they were consumables like bombs or arrows. In the latest installment, however, you can lose your weapon mid-fight. You then have to either scrounge for a new weapon, retreat, or stockpile weapons for that eventuality. It encouraged more planning, reacting, and that feeling you're just scraping by. It made the collapsed world of Breath of the Wild feel, well, wild and dangerous. Sure, you have a stockpile of weapons, but the Red Moon is just around the corner, and you're a long way from safety. It made the world feel challenging, not just being told that the world is a dangerous place. All of this is in service to the story that the game is telling, too. This isn't the comfy Hyrule you've played in other games. It's something different. And when you pair weapons breaking and being a finite resource with the respawning enemies, it's hard to not feel that the game is actively trying to kill you. And that's what makes this world so much richer and engaging, as opposed to just telling the player it's a dangerous place, but then letting them clear out areas to be safe. If you do this poorly, however, you can have mechanics that actively conflict with what you're trying to convey. Take, for instance, the return to office situation that Adam Jensen has in Deus Ex: Human Revolution. It's the first social hub in the game, and like any social hub, it's encouraging you to stop, talk with everyone, and explore. Especially after the intro, where Adam is thrown around like a rag doll and grievously maimed, it feels like narratively we should be doing the welcome back from sick leave with our old coworkers. But the game is actively fighting this by having a radio buddy incessantly nagging us to get to the helipad for our first mission. This builds tension, sure, but it also is demanding the player to ignore all of this interesting stuff that we've just introduced and chase the main plotline. There's something to be said for putting that tension on the player, especially towards the climax of the game, but this isn't near any climax. This is at the very beginning of the game. Barely introduced to our character, barely familiar with the controls, and a new area to explore, and on top of that being demanded to ignore everything I just said and chase the story. Now, I'm not a particularly good writer, but this, at a high level, seems to be a good place to change the plot points around to better align the story and the mechanical progression. What mechanics are we looking at here, though? It's a social hub, so we want the player to get used to the controls and learn that actively talking to people yields rewards. Sure, there needs to be something to push the player along to the first combat mission, but the timer they introduced here mechanically is actively pressuring the player to go in half ready. Now, if that was the point of putting this exploration social hub here before the action, fair enough. But it doesn't feel like that to me. Instead, it feels like the game is actively trying to get a message across, but that message is clashing with the mechanics. And while I'd love to critique Deus Ex further, let's get back to the reason I brought this up. The mechanics are actively fighting the message here. If you want to keep the player actively engaging with your story and world, you need to be mindful of what the current mechanics and the story are telling them at that time. They should be working together to get that overall message across. And in the case of Human Revolution, that's just not happening at the beginning of the game. The only mechanic that is conveyed with this area is that if you dawdle and explore the area, you're going to be punished by the game later. And that's not necessarily the point of the social hub, especially in any Deus Ex game. Be extremely careful about what the actual message you're sending to the player with your mechanics and stories tied together at any given time. If you're having issues identifying either, playtest that particular area in detail. When you're looking at the message and story, make sure you're not judging the player for their choices. There can be consequences, sure, but the game shouldn't be moralizing those consequences. In the Deus Ex example, the first mission is a hostage rescue. And if you're too slow to get to the chopper in the social hub, you're put in an actively worse situation when you finally get to that first mission. It works to get the message across, but then the game has your radio buddy yelling at you for being too slow, moralizing the consequences of your actions. And then the message becomes you're working for a terrible boss who wants to micromanage you and not actually resolve anything. That's a different message, isn't it? If that's what the team was going for, then that message comes across very clearly. But if not, then the moralizing done by your radio buddy has single-handedly muddled the message. That's why I say be very careful when you want to moralize or criticize the player's actions in your game. You may have a fun mechanic, but if your message is that your fun mechanic is bad, actually, then you have your message and the mechanics conflicting with each other. And you don't want to have that in your game. You want them both to be working together and going in the same direction. A moralizing message is much easier to disregard when you're having too much fun with the mechanics. Don't ask your players to make the choice. You may not like the choice they're going to make. Well, that should be enough for this side quest. As always, if you have any comments, suggestions, or feedback, reach out under this episode or to me directly on various social media. My handle is JCSIRRON, JC Suron. This has been an Adventure Mechanic side quest. I'll talk to you next time. The intro and outro music are excerpts from Plinian, retro gaming version, royalty free. Music provided and produced by Lone Peak Music. Link in the description.